Conflict and Communication. Week 3, Relationships. Analyzing relationships. This video discusses key terms, theories, models, and tools that you can use to analyze interpersonal relationships. By the end of this video, you should be able to 1. Identify and categorize interpersonal relationships, and 2. Identify relational factors which may influence conflict situations. These include why we develop relationships, how relationships develop over time, and tensions within relationships. Review. So we have a model of conflict that includes attitudes, behaviors, and core issues. And this model also states that conflict is further embedded in relationships, a broader context, and a series of historical factors. We call this part in the middle the episode and the broader part the epicenter. And we also talked about how an episode can serve as a window into an epicenter. Today we're going to focus on the epicenter. In fact, we're going to focus just on the relationship. Sometimes you might hear me use the word relational context to describe this. Identifying interpersonal relationships. Oh, you see this thing here? I'm going to throw that up anytime I'm presenting material that you won't find in the course textbook. Just FYI to help you out. So what makes a relationship interpersonal? It actually depends on how you define interpersonal relationships. In fact, there's two ways that you can define interpersonal relationships: a quantitative way and a qualitative way. The quantitative definition focuses on the number of parties involved. The qualitative definition focuses on the characteristics of the relationship. With a quantitative definition, you can say a relationship is interpersonal anytime two people or a dyad are in a relationship. So that means that when I go to Safeway, the relationship between me and the cashier, that's an interpersonal relationship. My relationship with every single one of you, that's an interpersonal relationship. My relationship with my closest friends, also an interpersonal relationship. And even my relationship with my husband, that's also an interpersonal relationship. The qualitative definition of interpersonal relationships actually sets out a series of criteria used to determine if a relationship should be classified as interpersonal. First, every interpersonal relationship is unique. You can't be in the same type of relationship with one friend that you are with another friend. Every relationship is unique. There's something different about it. Because of this difference, that relationship is irreplaceable, which means if you lose that relationship, you really feel a great sense of loss because you can never have another relationship quite like that one. Third, in an interpersonal relationship, there's a high level of disclosure. Both parties share a great deal of information about themselves. Next, these relationships have some kind of an intrinsic reward. There's a reason why you want to be with someone that kind of goes beyond what you need to get from them. You just like being with them. There's intrinsic rewards that come from being in that relationship. And lastly, there's a high level of interdependence between the folks that are in the relationship. You depend on each other in some way, shape, or form and influence each other considerably. The qualitative definition of interpersonal relationships also suggests that the opposite of an interpersonal relationship, or a relationship that doesn't meet this established criteria, can be termed impersonal. This means that we can classify our relationships as either interpersonal or impersonal. So let's consider my examples from before. The interaction between me and the Safeway cashier, most likely impersonal. Right now, my relationship with the majority of you, that would be classified as impersonal. We don't know each other that well right now. But my interactions with my close friends, Those would be interpersonal. Obviously, my interaction with my husband, that would also be interpersonal. However, relationships can change over time as individuals share more information about themselves and spend more time together. A relationship that starts off as impersonal can become more interpersonal over time. If I'm a regular at Safeway and always go to the same cashier, our relationship may start to develop more interpersonal characteristics. Similarly, as you and I get to know each other, our relationship can shift from impersonal to interpersonal. So, when classifying a relationship, it may be more useful to think in terms of a spectrum, with impersonal and interpersonal at either ends. A relationship can then shift from one end to the other, as each party discloses more information about themselves, spends more time together, and generally has more contact. So then, when we talk about relationships, we can identify to what degree they are qualitatively impersonal or interpersonal. Pause the video. Think about one of your closest relationships. How does it meet the criteria for an interpersonal relationship, qualitatively defined? Classifying interpersonal relationships. The textbook does a nice job of presenting two classification schemes. First, we can talk about the origin of the relationship, and we can talk about the context in which the relationship occurs. In terms of origin, we can differentiate between relationships of circumstance and relationships of choice. A relationship of circumstance is based upon the situations that we're in. For example, in the class, most of you will have a relationship of circumstance because you're in the class together. A relationship of choice, well, that's something that you actively seek to develop further. So, relationships with your closer friends, those would be relationships of choice. Talking about the context of relationships, we can identify family relationships, friendships, professional relationships, and romantic or intimate relationships, and all of these have particular characteristics. The textbook does a nice job of explaining these contexts further. One thing we can ask ourselves is what might be missing from this list? Are there any other contexts that should be added? Now, one additional thing to think about in terms of context are internal working models. These are basically our general ways of handling and dealing with relationships that are developed through our early experiences, particularly our early family experiences and our early friendships. Although I think you could also make a case for saying that early professional relationships and early romantic relationships shape the way in which we handle future interactions. Again, all of these things develop internal working models that shape how we go about managing our relationships. Pause the video. Go back to the relationship you thought of before. How would you classify this relationship? Would it be a relationship of choice or a relationship of circumstance? Maybe it started as a relationship of circumstance, but then changed and became a relationship of choice. What's the context of this relationship? Relational factors which influence conflict situations, or how the epicenter impacts the episode, or how does this impact that? Why we form relationships. Why do we do this? Relationships are hard. Why bother? Well, effectively, we need relationships to meet our needs, and we need relationships to fulfill our goals. We can talk about three theories: human needs theory, social capital theory, and social exchange theory. The textbook goes through all three. Human needs theory. Remember the onion diagram that we use to analyze positions, goals, and needs? Well, we're going to talk about the very center of it, our basic human needs. We can talk about our need for inclusion and connection, our need for control and influence, and our need for affection. This is the textbook's classification of human needs. So, our need for inclusion and connection basically relates to our need to be, well, connected to others, both to have our basic needs for things like food and shelter met, as well as our needs for social interaction and friendship. Now, what the textbook calls a need for control is really more of a need to influence. That is, the need to influence relationships, decisions, and activities, as well as the need to be influenced by others. Think of it more in terms of how we need others to teach us, how we need to engage with others in order to learn more about the world and about ourselves. And lastly, we have a need for affection. We need to feel like we're liked by others. This includes physical affection, as well as affection that's displayed through other verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Moving on to social capital theory, this is draws from a theorist by the name of Pierre Bourdieu, who basically argues that our relationships are actually a resource that can be converted into economic and other benefits. Forms of social capital can be further broken down into bonding social capital, bridging social capital, and linking social capital. Bonding social capital are the benefits that result from close relationships with our families. Bridging social capital are the benefits that result from connections with friends and other very close associates. And lastly, linking social capital are the benefits that result from relationships with people in positions of power who are kind of sit outside of our usual social network. Take a look at these photos. How might you classify these as either bonding, bridging, or linking forms of social capital? Moving on to social exchange theory, basically, this uses an economic model to weigh the costs and benefits associated with a given relationship. So basically, the idea is that when we're in a relationship, we're sort of constantly evaluating the benefits of that relationship and the associated costs. If we decide that the costs outweigh the benefits, then we are far more likely to terminate that relationship. Pause the video. Think to yourself, how could we use human needs theory, social capital theory, and or social exchange theory to help analyze interpersonal conflict? Developing relationships. One of the central ways in which we develop relationships is through the sharing of information. This is the premise of social penetration theory, which suggests that we develop intimacy in our relationships through the sharing of information. Self disclosure is the term that we use for describing that process of sharing personal information, which we can analyze in terms of the breadth and the depth of our sharing. Breadth refers to the number of topics you're willing to share with another person. So, for example, maybe you're willing to talk to a friend about your hobbies, interests, or romantic relationships, but are not willing to talk about, say, your family or your own childhood experiences. Depth refers to how deeply you are willing to share about each topic. For example, maybe you're willing to tell your friend the name of the person you are in a romantic relationship with, but are not willing to share details about the fight you had with this person the other night. One tool that you can use to analyze the extent of self disclosure within a given relationship is called the Johari window. This basically requires you to identify the information about yourself that you are willing and unwilling to share with others. We'll be using this tool in class. Now, there are some particular risks and benefits to self disclosure. The textbook does identify a few, particularly in terms of risks associated with safety, things like identity theft and stalking, reasons why you might want to be careful in terms of how much information you share. But there's other things we can consider. Firstly, when we disclose information about ourselves, we do run the risk of rejection. Maybe we'll be socially ostracized for sharing what's on our minds. Disclosing information can also impact how other people see us. For example, if you're trying to present yourself in a particular way, you need to be very careful when talking about, say, your own faults and mistakes. Lastly, disclosing information can also hurt the person you are talking to or damage your relationship with them. For example, and this is a very superficial example, let's say a friend asks your opinion regarding the shirt that they're wearing. You think it's ugly and you tell them. But maybe that's not what they actually wanted to hear and they actually get offended. There are also numerous benefits to self disclosure. The textbook emphasizes that self disclosure has intrinsic rewards. People enjoy talking about themselves and sharing with others. Sharing can also improve one's overall well being. Think of how good it often feels to get something off your chest, or how the sharing of stories is often a key component of healing from traumatic experiences. We also choose to disclose information because we believe it is the morally correct thing to do. For example, you may choose to admit when you have done something wrong, despite potential consequences, because keeping that secret does not sit well with you morally. It doesn't feel right or correspond with your own perception of who you are as a person. On the other hand, our decision to disclose information, and particularly information that might damage our reputation, can be a very strategic choice. We may choose to be upfront about things that we've done wrong or mistakes that we've made so that we can help shape how other people receive and interpret that information. We often see this with public figures like celebrities or politicians who opt to disclose information about themselves or things that they have done so as to control the public narrative. Self disclosure can also be of benefit to our relationships. Sharing information about ourselves can not only deepen our connection to another person, but can encourage that person to share more information about themselves. That is, self disclosure encourages reciprocal sharing that can strengthen a relationship. Lastly, by strengthening relationships and helping us manage how other people see us, self-disclosure can help us to increase our capacity to influence and or support other people. Consider for example how self-disclosure operates in support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, or even what's happening online right now with the hashtag #MeToo movement. So self-disclosure can help to strengthen relationships. But what if we don't really want a deeper relationship with a particular person? We all employ a variety of strategies for managing intimacy. That is, for managing how close we get to other people and how close we let other people get to us. This includes a variety of distancing strategies that we use to avoid developing relationships and or to minimize our level of self-disclosure within a relationship. Often, we may simply avoid interacting with the other person completely. If this isn't possible, we may hold back on sharing, that is, reduce the depth of our self disclosure and keeping our discussions superficial, and even shortening interactions where possible. We may also restrict the number of topics we talk about, that is, reduce the breadth of our self disclosure. Showing restraint in our interactions is another possibility. This would include, for example, not laughing at someone's jokes or asking them further questions. Lastly, lying, that is, deception, or not telling the whole truth about what we are thinking, is another way that we may minimize self disclosure and reduce the level of intimacy in a given relationship. Pause the video. How can the concept of self disclosure help us to analyze interpersonal conflicts? The development of relationships over time. The textbook identifies several stages of relational development, suggesting that we can think of these stages like an elevator. We get into the relationship goes up, the relationship comes down, and then we leave the relationship. This is based on the work of Mark Knapp, a very prominent scholar in the study of nonverbal behavior and interpersonal relationships. Knapp specifically identified 10 stages through which relationships move. This model is actually based upon studies of romantic relationships, but it can be applied to relationships more generally. We begin in the initiation phase, wherein we first notice another person and form a first impression based upon a variety of verbal and nonverbal messages and interpretations. We then move on to the experimenting stage, where we look for common ground with the other person by sharing information on various topics. The exchanges here are still generally quite superficial. There is a lot of breadth to our self disclosure, but not a lot of depth. During the intensifying stage, we spend more time with the other person, and the level of reciprocal self disclosure between both parties deepens. During the integration stage, you start to see each other less as two distinct individuals and more as a social unit. For example, in a romantic relationship, you would become a couple or partners and develop shared daily rituals and maybe insider language, like inside jokes. When a pair reaches a bonding stage, they communicate the status of their relationship in a more formal or public way. With romantic relationships, this could include, for example, changing your relationship status on Facebook. These first five stages are collectively called coming together. Or to go back to the elevator metaphor, this is when we enter into the relationship and the relationship goes up. Then, according to this model, the relationship comes down. This starts as the two people begin to differentiate. They start to shift away from a shared identity and begin to reestablish their individual identities, decreasing contact in interactions. Sometimes the pair will then go back into reestablishing the relationship. However, if the differentiation continues, the relationship may move into the circumscribing stage, wherein the communication between the parties becomes less frequent and more superficial. You might also say that the relationship becomes less interpersonal and more impersonal. If this continues, the relationship will stagnate, becoming shallow and predictable. The extent to which the parties care about the relationship also decreases. If the parties don't work to reestablish the relationship, they may begin avoiding each other. You ignore each other, and your interactions become even more impersonal. Lastly, one or both parties may decide to formally end the relationship. These last five stages are collectively called coming apart. This is where we come down the elevator and get off. This is a good overview of the stages, but it doesn't totally capture what Knapp was trying to describe, particularly in his later works. To unpack this further, we can keep the idea that relationships go up and down, and we can use the terms coming together and coming apart to describe these processes. We can also keep the 10 stages, but we're going to flatten out the model just a little bit to account for relationships that don't end. In these relationships, the people involved undertake a continual process of relational maintenance, wherein they move back and forth through primarily the stages of integrating, bonding, and differentiating, constantly working to manage the tension between their need for establishing a sense of self and autonomy while also trying to meet their need for connection. In this expanded model, there are three main phases of relational development: coming together, relational maintenance, and coming apart. Tensions within relationships. Let's go back to human needs theory. So, we are all trying to have our basic needs met both within and through our relationships. However, the way we go about having our needs met varies considerably. So, in a relationship, while we may share a basic need with the other party, our goals and positions are often very different. The textbook suggests that in relationships, people are constantly trying to find the best way of having their needs met. For example, as we try to meet our need for inclusion in a relationship, we have to find a balance between meeting our need for inclusion, wanting to be with the other person, while without smothering them. They suggest that those who work too hard to seek attention and be liked by others are over-social, while those who avoid interactions are under-social. As we try to meet our need for control or influence, we have to find a balance between trying to influence others and allowing ourselves to be influenced. Those who are constantly seeking to control others are considered over-controlling, while those who passively allow themselves to be controlled or influenced are considered under-controlling. As we try to meet our need for affection, we have to balance our need to be liked by others while also being okay with not being liked by everyone. Those who are what the textbook call overpersonal try too hard to be liked by everyone, while those who are underpersonal assume that they will never be liked and try to avoid relationships altogether. Obviously, these terms, oversocial, undersocial, overcontrolling, undercontrolling, overpersonal, underpersonal, are extremes. And in reality, we all move between these extremes in our interactions with others. Another way in which tensions within relationships are presented in scholarship from the study of interpersonal communication is through the notion of dialectical tensions. This scholarship, which focuses again on romantic relationships, suggests, again, that we have these competing goals that are of equal importance. Specifically, two people within a relationship both want connection and autonomy. That is, they want to feel close to the other party without completely losing their sense of independence. Each person also wants both predictability and novelty. That is, they want some stability in the relationship, but don't want to get bored. Lastly, each person wants both openness and closedness within the relationship. This relates to the idea of self-disclosure. We try to be both open with our partner, but also want to keep some information to ourselves. So within our relationships, we are constantly trying to negotiate these competing goals, both within ourselves and with the other party. At the same time, the couple also perceives themselves as a social unit, and as a unit, wants to engage with others, that is, with the world in general, in ways that are also characterized by dialectical tensions. First, the couple wants to be both included and secluded. That is, the pair wants to be part of the world while also being able to just spend time together. So, for example, say there's a couple trying to decide if they should go out for dinner with a group of friends or just stay home and watch Netflix. This would be an example of the inclusion-seclusion dialectic. Secondly, the couple wants to be socially recognized as a couple while also not feeling like they have to abide by every single dominant social norm regarding what a couple should be or look like. So they want to be seen as a unique couple with their own way of doing things while still being socially accepted as a couple. Lastly, the dialectic of revelation and concealment refers to the couple's desire to both share information about their relationship with others while still keeping some details to themselves. So a couple needs to negotiate how much they will share with others about the relationship. There are similarities between each pair of dialectics, and each pair can be further classified as follows. Connection autonomy and inclusion seclusion are both manifestations of an integration separation dialectic. Again, this idea of wanting to be with others while also being separate from others. Predictability, novelty, and conventionality and uniqueness both fall under the stability change dialectic. Again, this idea for both predictability and conventionality, as well as difference and uniqueness. Openness, closedness, and revelation concealment both fall under the expression privacy dialectic. Again, this need to both share information with others while also keeping certain information to themselves. Pause the video. Think to yourself, how can the notion of dialectical tensions help us to analyze interpersonal conflict? This video discussed key terms, theories, models, and tools that you can use to analyze interpersonal relationships. You should be able to identify and categorize interpersonal relationships, identify relational factors which may influence conflict situations, and these various factors include why we develop relationships, how relationships develop over time, and tensions within relationships.